You're listening to The Solution, a podcast by Growers Mineral. I'm your producer, Russell Bobel. In today's episode, our research team sits down to discuss the topic of hydrology and why it matters to farmers. There's also a video version of these episodes available on YouTube. Search Growers Mineral on YouTube to find our channel. Now, on to the conversation.
Zach, Jim, thanks for joining me today. We're here to talk about hydrology as a topic. And I'd like to start out with, Zach, can you share a little bit of a kind of basic background on hydrology, just in case people listening aren't familiar with what it is?
Sure, Marguerite. Hydrology is just the study of water. So we're all familiar, I think, with the water cycle. If you've all seen that diagram where there's clouds at the top and there'll be a lake and then some land with some trees growing out of it. So you've got precipitation, condensation, evaporation, infiltration, evapotranspiration, and others as well. That's all how water moves through the environment, the atmosphere, the biosphere, the hydrosphere, and how it interacts with those things. So obviously water is very important in our society and to our world. It's covered, the earth is covered by, or the vast majority of it's covered by water, even if it's saline. And as farmers, water is one of the most important factors in raising a crop and raising animals. Without it, you can do nothing. With too much of it, you can't do much. So
you do nothing.
Yeah, you can do nothing with too much of it. The guys who keep getting hit by hurricanes on the East Coast could tell us that. So understanding how it works, how the water cycle works, the characteristics of water itself, can give guys a good baseline for how to properly operate their farm, how to make the most of the water they do have access to. Especially that's important. And then later on, we can get into topics such as pollution and all that as well. The purpose of this podcast, though, I'd like to just lay down the foundation and give guys an understanding of how water works and the effects it has.
Absolutely, which is perfect. You know, Zach, too, I know you picked this topic and you were pretty excited to pick this topic. So tell us a little too of why is this such an interesting topic to you? Why water? Why hydrology?
Yeah. For people that know me well, they would be surprised that I like hydrology. They'd be surprised for the reasons I like it. So I'm not a math person. Throughout all of my schooling, university included, I despised math. I was never terrible at it, but I despised it. And then in my first year of university, I took a hydrology course. Despite it being a first year course, it was hands down the most difficult course I ever took. I was told by many people once I'd signed up for it that it was actually probably more of a fourth year level difficulty course. And it was certainly difficult. I mean, there's a lot of math involved, a lot of work, but it was also probably one of the most useful courses that I ever took. And then as my years went on, I didn't take another specific hydrology course, but other courses expanded upon that knowledge, or I was able to use that knowledge in those courses. And a lot of them talked about water in different ways. So despite me not liking math, what really interests me about water is almost the logic of it. That water is predictable, it's logical, it reacts the same way to the same pressures every time. When water hits 0 degrees Celsius, it freezes, or 32 degrees Fahrenheit for you Americans. When water hits 100 degrees Celsius, I can't tell you what that is in Fahrenheit, it boils. It always runs downhill, gravity. Water cannot be compressed. Stuff like this means that you can look at rain falling on a piece of land, and if you know all of the factors that are going to influence it, you know what that water is going to do. There's predictability there. Now, knowing what all those factors are is another case. That's certainly not always easy, but water acts the same every single time if you know the pressures on it. So that's why it was always so interesting to me. I could wrap my mind around it quite well because it didn't change. It wasn't, one day it was running down this hill to the east, but the next day it was running up the hill to the west. That doesn't happen. And so in the chaos of first year university, having a course that was difficult, but that you could always rely on to make sense, was kind of grounding. It was nice. And that spurred my interest in hydrology. So when I had the opportunity to pick a topic here, it's important to agriculture. It's not just a personal interest, but this is a topic we can explore in great depth, and it still make perfect sense.
I love that. It definitely is very, very important to agriculture, but it's very interesting why it is a topic that you like so much. So I thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. So just kind of start to, I know that you have maybe a specific part of the hydrology system you want to focus on. What do you want to focus on? Where do you want to start? Let's go there.
So to start, I'll say this won't be our only podcast on this topic. As I said before, this one's just to kind of lay a foundation, which is, if you've listened to our other podcasts, at least the ones that I'm on, it's a pretty common pattern for the first one in a topic. The entire water cycle impacts agriculture, to be perfectly clear. It doesn't matter if water is being evaporated from the Western Pacific Ocean or the Indian Ocean. Eventually, it's going to have an impact on farmers in North America. Water that's evaporated out of Lake Erie will eventually impact people in Asia. It's all connected. And so learning about every part of that cycle is certainly important. For today's podcast, though, I would like to kind of focus in on what happens when that water actually falls on the ground and immediately following that. So that be mainly obviously precipitation, and then, something called interference, surface runoff, infiltration, and maybe touch a little bit on how water tables work, if we have time. So this is to give you guys, some of you guys may already know all this stuff. That's fine. Some of you may not, and that's hopefully why you're listening to this. So to start, we've all seen precipitation. It can come in rain, hail, snow. We're going to focus on rain for now because it's the simplest, liquid water. So when it first hits the soil, if it gets to the soil, so interception, that one word I mentioned, is simply something catching that water before it reaches the soil. So that can be a roof, eaves trough. That can be leaves. That can be a building, trees. It could be animals if they're outside. Any of those things are going to catch some of that water. And that water will never, in theory, unless it runs off onto the ground, that water will not make it into a surface water reservoir or into the ground. And so this is, in terms of hydrology, you always have what's called the water budget, right? How much water is falling and how much of that water is being allocated to different areas. How much of it is going into the water table underground, how much of it's running off into a stream and then a lake and eventually the ocean, how much of it's being intercepted and either used by, if I held a cup up in the rain and then drank it, that water is now being used by my body. It's not going to be, until I pee, it's not going to be accessible by anything else. Or it could be, if it's on a leaf, it might be absorbed a bit into the leaf, and then it might evaporate off when the sun comes out. And so this is all the water budget. What happens to that water? Now, once it reaches the ground, it can do one of two things. It can run off the surface. That's pretty straightforward what that is. Or it can absorb into the ground, into the soil. And so surface runoff, as I said, is pretty straightforward. It's just, it runs along the surface. It can erode. It can pick up organic matter. In extreme volumes, it can cause quite a bit of damage. But that surface water very quickly, or relatively quickly, will flow into a stream, which will flow into a river, which will flow into a lake or a pond. Eventually, it's going to reach the ocean. All water on the surface eventually makes its way back to the ocean, unless it gets used before that, sucked up into a water treatment plant or something like that. Groundwater is a little more interesting and I think more impactful in agriculture, because plants don't absorb water out of rivers. They absorb water out of the ground. And so unless you have a plant with an extremely, extremely deep rooting system, or you're in an area with a very shallow water table, most plants don't have roots in the water table. Most plants don't want roots in the water table because that's a zone of constant saturation. And roots don't often function that way unless it's very, very specific plant. And so you have, I'm drawing a blank on the actual terms, but for layman's terms, you essentially have the unsaturated zone in the soil and you have the saturated zone. The unsaturated zone is above the water table. And so when I say unsaturated, that doesn't mean it's dry. It simply means that there's airspace in there, or it's been compacted and there's no space for anything. So that's including the root zone. So a lot of water will absorb into the soil and it'll stay in the root zone. It won't keep going further into the soil. And there's a variety of reasons for that, but we need that. That's where it's primarily accessible to plants. And so a plant absorbs the water, and we can get into this more. Jim will be able to speak on this topic, I'm sure, better than I can. What happens once a plant has absorbed water? It obviously uses some of it like our bodies do, but it will also transpire some of it into the atmosphere. And that's another pathway that the water never reaches a water table or anything. It goes back into the atmosphere. As water infiltrates deeper into the ground, it'll go past the root zone and no longer be accessible. And depending on how deep the water table is, so for those of you that may understand, when I say a deep water table or a shallow water table, I'm not referring to the size of the water table itself. I'm referring to how far below the surface of the soil it's located, the saturated zone is located. So a shallow water table is a water table that's located very close to the surface of the soil. A deep water table is one that's located very far down. So in desert environments, you can have massive underground reservoirs of water, but they're probably going to be very deep and very old. They call that, I think Margaret, you might know fossil water or something like that, where these reservoirs are no longer, like in Africa, the desert regions of Africa, they have massive underground reservoirs of groundwater. But since there's no rain really there, these reservoirs are not being recharged, but they're still drawing water out of them. It's called fossil water because that's water from ages past that infiltrated down there, but it's not being recharged. So once you take that water out, unless there's some artificial method of pumping that water back in, you can only draw down that water table. Whereas in areas like this, where we get the decent amount of rainfall, you can get water table recharge. And that's vitally important since a lot of towns and cities rely on those water tables for their water sources. A lot will take it out of a surface water, but like where I live in Kitchener, Ontario, we have a pretty major river that flows through town called the Grand River, but Kitchener only takes 25% of its drinking water from the Grand. The rest of it is groundwater. And so we have to actually use that sustainably. Otherwise, one day it's going to get dried up and we're screwed, or we're taking it out of the dirty Grand. So Russ, you can always edit this next part out if you want, but there's a funny story here. The Grand River there's quite a few municipalities located on it before it empties into Lake Erie. And downstream from Kitchener-Waterloo, which is it's a pretty decent sized urban area, is a town called Brantford. And Brantford is usually made fun of as like one of the buttholes of Ontario. But we always make fun of them because they take almost all of their drinking water out of the Grand River. It gets much wider down there. So we always make fun of them that after we take a dump or a pee and it gets emptied into the Grand River, they drink that water next. So Ross, you can edit that part out, but I always enjoy myself a good poop joke. Anyway, moving on.
I have to say, I think it's interesting too that you know so much about where the water is coming from right where you are. Because I have to say, I mean, in all fairness, we did just move, but I am not very aware of where we get our water in Vermilion.
You're right on the lake pretty well, right?
I mean, yeah, we're pretty close. We're closer to the lake than Milan is. Yeah.
I'd imagine you're probably getting it from the lake.
Yeah, probably.
I doubt that groundwater is obviously harder to access, right, than surface water. So most places that have access to a decent source of surface water will take that instead. And I think the large majority, unless you're on a well system, which is probably not true in a town.
We're definitely not in a well system. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll tell you that.
You're probably taking it out of the lake. So
that's great.
Yeah. One more side tangent I want to go off on because it's quite important to the human relationship to water is a little bit of what happened with the Flint water crisis in Michigan. I'm not going to go into great detail. I know that it was a very political situation, but the main problem is Flint, being an older town, had a lot of lead piping. Now, when they were getting their water from the Lake Huron, the water was relatively hard and so had a little bit of a higher pH, and there was no problem with it running through the lead pipes. But then they switched to the Flint River. The Flint River is a much softer water, and soft water usually has a lower pH, more acidic. And so when they started flowing that soft water through these lead pipes, it began leaching lead out of the pipes. And that's what caused all the health problems. It was lead poisoning. It wasn't necessarily, the Flint River, I don't think, is a very clean river. Don't get me wrong, but I don't think that was the main problem. It was rather that it was leaching lead out of these pipes because of its acidity. And so these are some of the factors that have to be taken into account when you're looking at water sources. It's not just, what's in the water, how dirty is it? It's how does this water interact with our infrastructure? Is it going to leach lead? Because a lot of places in North America still have lead piping being used because it'd be a massive expenditure to replace it. So what's the solution there? Anyway, and that side tangent to the effect water can have on human health and those decisions. A lot of guys, with what I've just said, might think it's best to try to keep as much water as you can in the unsaturated zone, in the root zone. And certainly to a degree, you want water in there, but you don't want it to become saturated. As Growers has hammered home a time and again, we need to have airspace in the root zone. You don't want too much water there. You also want the water table to be recharged. Every farm that's on a well, that well is not getting water out of the unsaturated zone. That well is going as deep as it needs to go to reach the water table. So if that water table is not being sufficiently recharged, usually because the surface has become impermeable and too much water is running off the surface and not enough of it infiltrating down, eventually that water table is going to start to lower. You'll get what's called zones of depression around well heads, where you'll get, if you have a well drilled right here where my microphone is, and let's say it's, the water table usually sits here, and the bottom of the well is down here, and there's no recharge going. You're going to get that water start to do this, the surface of the water table, and dip down because it's all being drawn up by this well. So far away from the well, the table, since water underground does not move as fluidly as it does on the surface, it doesn't, as soon as you suck water here, it's not like more water comes rushing in from the sides to replace it. It eventually does. But you like the zone is called a zone of depression. Water sucks down, and then you get farmers having to drill new wells because suddenly their well ran dry. Well, that's because the water table is not being recharged enough, or because they were drawing too much out of the well. This is especially a problem in drier areas where the water table is not recharged as easily. So these are also things that you have to keep in mind. I don't think I have much else to add right now, unless Marguerite, you have more questions, and Jim, if you want to add anything.
I definitely have a question, and I want to hear Jim's input too, but I'm hearing like a lot of problems with water and how we get it, and thinking about it. So what I'm thinking you're saying here is a big part of water for farming, and Jim can probably attest to this, is being aware of where your water is coming from and how much of it you're using, and really how much of it is available, right?
The water budget.
Yeah. Okay. So your water budget. Yeah. So that's what you're talking about. So Jim, maybe you can share a little bit on that, as a farmer, and, also with your chemistry background, how much time do you spend thinking about your water budget on your farm?
Again, it depends on where the farm is at. If they're in a more arid region where they're using irrigation, they're using what are called tensiometers to measure availability. When Zach was talking about percolation into the soil, you don't want that water to stay there because it pushes out all the oxygen that's in the root zone. So it has to move through, but you need to maintain some of that water. And the clays and the organic matter that are in the soil electrically hold on to the water. There's different zones on the edge of the clay particle. One is called hygroscopic zone, and that's an area where the clay hangs onto the water so tightly the plant can't pull the water from the clay particle. And then there's another zone called field capacity, and that is farther away from the clay, but it still retains a certain amount of water, but the amount of pressure that's being held, or the water's being held at, the plant can easily pull it away. So you have that region of water that surrounds the clay and the organic matter that the plant can recharge itself with that water. And you're trying to make that at a proper site so that there's air there also. When you have water that doesn't have proper oxygen content in it, the plant's ability to use it is very, very poor because it needs air to breathe. Everybody thinks of green growing crops as photosynthesizing, making sugar. And in that process, you take on carbon dioxide to make the sugar and you give off oxygen. But in the root zone where there's no chloroplast or green coloring, the plant is constantly breathing like an animal does. So it's always expelling CO2 and taking on oxygen. And if you can't refresh that oxygen in there, the plant's focus starts to go down. It's like you run a 100-yard dash. By the end of the 100-yard dash, your ability to function is down considerably. And so you don't want that plant to ever be into that stress mode. So again, how much of that water you can maintain that the plant can use, but still service it with oxygen, that's a critical area in there. And you use irrigation to try to fill that zone up. But again, it's an extra cost. It's more time. It takes away from your ability to do other things. So again, the idea from the growers program is to create an environment that when you do get a rain, you hold that certain amount of water that allows air to come in at the same time. And the deeper you can do that in the profile, the deeper roots will progress. So it gives them a larger reservoir to pull water from. So you don't need a rain every other day or every other third day. If you get a very decent root zone, you might be able to go a couple months without a decent rain and still grow a very competitive crop. So that's the tough part of managing the water and getting it so that it's there when you need it without artificially bringing it back, which can be problematic. Because if your quality is low, you bring back water that's not good for your environment, and that can be harmful to the plant too.
So what about that's almost having the right amount of water or not enough water? What about if you have a huge excess of water? How do you manage that in that same way of keeping the oxygen to the plant but not drowning the plants? How does that play out?
The way we suggest farmers is when you apply certain levels of the element calcium, that flocculates that soil and puts it in an oxidized condition where the water will percolate through. Now, another thing that you see a lot of in the more humid areas, like we have here in Ohio, is guys put tile in. And see, the idea of the tile is when you get that excessive rain event, the water can move to the tile and then drain away into drainage areas, which eventually will go in to a water reservoir system. For where I farm, it would be Lake Erie. And part of the problem with that is that occurs very quickly because the tile are not really that deep in the profile. They may be down there 35 inches, 36 inches, something like that. And so if you get that heavy rainfall event and that water runs quickly to that tile, it solubilizes nutrients and carries nutrients with it into the tile. Everybody has the conception that fertilizer runs off the top of the land into the water systems. And there is a fair amount of that, but also it can get into the quick water that goes into the tile system, solubilizes, and you're bringing nutrients out of that soil through the tile system too. So you actually have two sources that are contaminating the Lake Erie Basin, basically. So
I've got a question, Jim, for something you said. In looking at how plants can use the water in the soil, is it only a matter of like having airspace and water pore space, or does the level of dissolved oxygen in the water matter as well?
Yeah, it will affect it, Zach. you'll where the clay particles hanging on to the water, that the edge of that water is up against an open area. So basically the oxygen that's in that open area will diffuse into that water. It's kind of like out into the atmosphere. So the issue is how much air can you get down into the soil with the water so that surface of that water molecule has plenty of oxygen to pull into itself. And see, that's where you get into wetter areas. Guys try to tile that out to get that replenishment of air in there so that you've got air for the plant root, but when the plant absorbs the water too, it has oxygen in it. And that's a key
Plants
factor.
can access that, eh? Plants can access the oxygen in water.
Yes, absolutely. Its effect, the way the water will work in the plant, if it's well oxidized versus if it's, more putrid, is going to be totally different. And see, we don't tend to think of that, but that air it's just like in the human, it's critical. We try to tell these farmers, look, okay, what is the most important thing that you're dealing with, in that soil? You yourself can live 3 months without eating. You can live 3 weeks without drinking. But when you put the bag over your head, you got 3 minutes. See, and that same principle applies to the crop. That same principle applies to the biological in the soil. Mm-hmm. That oxygen is a very key factor, very key factor.
Good. Thanks, Jim.
That's such a good analogy, Jim. I've heard you say that one a bunch of times, and it's really a vivid thought, but really makes it clear what you're trying to prioritize when you're doing farming. So I love that.
Yeah. See, and that's where tillage has gotten into farming, Marguerite. Guys have used that as kind of a crutch to artificially induce air into the soil. And see, when you do, you have several factors. You have the cost of the tillage. If the tillage is done incorrectly and it fluffs the soil up too much and you get a heavy rain, it can erode. What we try to do with growers with getting that environment correct by putting the calcium in there is to create as much oxygen as we can with less physical intervention. And number one, you save money. Number two, you don't make it as much of a mistake by doing the intervention at the wrong time. And see, the farmer never knows that. You're in there tilling the soil and all of a sudden thunder shower comes up and you get 3 inches in a half hour. That's a problem, see? And so trying to create the best environment so that you can absorb that without introducing artificial intervention, that's always going to be better. You're working with Mother Nature on that rather than trying to make the decision artificially. So
that's great. I am so excited for this topic because I feel that we have so many side topics that we can go down on this, right? I mean, this is a long road for hydrology. So I foresee quite a few episodes coming up. I took a few notes during of things Zach and Jim talked about future episodes we could do. So I'm very excited for this, and I hope everyone else listening is too. Zach, Jim, any final thoughts, today about what we talked about, or final things you want to share in this hydrology episode?
I'd like to give a shout out to all the Mennonites out there. Water that you consume in coffee doesn't count. Okay. You need to drink actual water. So 18 cups of coffee a day isn't hydrating you.
Doesn't the caffeine, dehydrate you at the same time? So you have water in there and caffeine. So it's just
a diuretic. So you're just going to go pee a lot more.
It's just an equalizer almost.
Yep.
I love it. All right. Well, thank you both for joining me and sharing your knowledge. And until next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marguerite. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please subscribe and share with a friend. If you'd like to learn more about the Growers Program, visit our website, www.growersmineral.com.